when we don't have enough energy, our hunger signals increase because our hunger is tied to not actually the fuel coming in, but what happens to it. It's tied to that ATP availability. When we're not converting fuel to energy well, or we don't have enough ATP in the liver or in a part of the brain called the hypothalamus, our hunger signals stay elevated. Our reproductive function is really dependent on thyroid function. Digestive function, very much dependent. Immune function. Chicken and pork fat can be just as high in polyunsaturated fats as the seed oils because that's a lot of the fat that they're consuming. They're eating a lot of soy and corn.
Do we need to keep our diet relatively low fat when we suffer or have hypothyroid, or can we have the good fat?
All of the reproductive hormones, progesterone, testosterone, all come from cholesterol. And the main determinant of that conversion is thyroid.
Today's guest is Jay Feldman, a metabolism and health expert who understands why you're exhausted, cold, and struggling with stubborn weight despite being told your labs are normal. Jay's here to explain why conventional thyroid treatment often fails and how hidden seed oils are sabotaging your metabolism. If you're tired of feeling confused and dismissed and want to know what to do, this conversation is for you.
I'm really excited to talk to you about metabolism and thyroid and all the things in between. I have so many clients who've had thyroid issues. I've had a lot of thyroid issues. So it was amazing to get your expertise and experience on the show today. I want to actually just dive straight in and ask you, how did you get so interested and how did you become an expert in metabolism and the thyroid?
Yeah. Well, I mean, my interest in health started at a pretty young age, just, personally wanting to perform my best in terms of fitness endeavors and as an athlete and that kind of thing. And evolved from there into, just a passion for, on one hand, learning, and then also on the other hand, just trying to improve my health to the extent that I could. And of course, it grew from there. And, I was studying, I was pre-med in college and was going to become a doctor and wanted to continue learning about health and help other people improve their health. And, with a little bit of time, I kind of realized I didn't think the mainstream medical model was the way that I wanted to go. I didn't feel like that was the ideal way that I could help people improve their health, and felt like in general, the orientation of that model is just toward managing symptoms as opposed to, actually improving health. So that was kind of the general trajectory. But after that, I pivoted and, did a lot of my own research, creating, writing articles, digging, real deep into the physiology and the research, and then applying that with people and helping people resolve and reverse all sorts of issues. Thyroid issues is a huge one, a really common one, just considering how much of our current environment is stacked against us in that way. And then beyond that, I mean, helping people deal with everything from, poor sleep, low libido, low energy, cold hands and feet, hair loss, autoimmune issues, high blood pressure, the whole gamut there.
All the things that we struggle with.
Yeah.
So I really want to take a bit of a focus on the thyroid, because here what you said is something that's really interesting to me. You mentioned the environment. Can you walk us through, Jay, the connection between our environment and our thyroid health?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a great place to start because our thyroid is our general regulator of our metabolism. Basically when our thyroid hormones are being produced in large amounts and we have a lot of conversion to the active thyroid hormones, we have a high metabolic rate, we're producing a lot of energy, and we also stimulate the activity of a lot of other organs. Our reproductive function is really dependent on thyroid function. Digestive function, very much dependent. Immune function. So it's something that is really kind of at the top. It's a broad master regulator of our metabolism and therefore also most other organ systems. And it's basically this metabolic dial that our bodies are turning up or down depending on what they're experiencing. If they're experiencing an environment that seems really favorable, there's a lot of really great nutrition available, we're not overly stressed, we're getting good healthy movement and sunlight, we have enough nutrition in terms of macronutrients and total amount of fuel coming in, but also the quality is good, and we're sleeping well and all of the rest, then our body says this is a really great situation. Let's turn that metabolic dial up and maximize our function. And on the flip side, when that's not happening, whether we're just not eating high quality foods, we're not sleeping a lot, we're stressed, we're not moving, or we're moving too much, or we're exposed to a lot of pesticides or various other things in our environment, a lot of polyunsaturated fats that I'm sure we'll talk about. All those things act as signals where our bodies say, this is not a great environment. I can't produce a lot of energy with what's being given to me. So I'm going to turn that metabolic dial down, shift into more of a hibernation, kind of low battery mode state, and kind of hang out here until the environment gets better, which hopefully it will. But if not, we'll just subsist here. This will be kind of, at least we can survive even if we're not thriving. And so that's the kind of low thyroid state that a lot of people find themselves in.
Mm-hmm. And how would someone know that they're suffering from low thyroid? And I'm really happy to give some insights on that based out of my own experience, but maybe for folks listening who don't know where they're at yet, and if you could point out a few common symptoms.
Yeah, there's a lot of really common symptoms. Low body temperature and feeling cold is a big one. Hair, skin, and nails, if those are not healthy, brittle nails, thin hair, hair falling out, that's really common as well. Dry skin. Some other ones, cold hands and feet would be a big one in addition to just cold body temperature. Low energy, feeling sluggish, low libido. Those are some of the classic ones, but we can really expand from there to other things like a propensity toward gaining weight, feeling like you can't eat a lot of food without, gaining weight, right? Like you're in a low, basically your body's running at a low metabolism. It's running at a low level. And so you can't use a lot of the fuel that's coming in. So those are some of the kind of common experiences.
I would love to expand on that a little bit before we dive deeper. Why is it that when our thyroid is low, our weight gains tend to be higher? Why do we struggle with our weight when our thyroid is low?
Yeah, so our thyroid is, as that master regulator, regulating our metabolism, regulating our energy production. It's regulating that step between the food that comes in and the energy we produce. Because the food that comes in, that acts as our fuel. We use that to produce energy, or ATP, and that is what allows all of our body to function. So when our environment's not ideal, we can't produce a lot of energy from the food, we turn our thyroid hormone down, or thyroid activity down. What that means is we have a lot of fuel that's not efficiently being converted to energy. And that means a couple of things. One, we don't have a lot of energy available for optimal function. But then two, we have a lot of leftover fuel that isn't going toward energy production, which means it has to be stored. And that's where we start to see the storage as body fat. So we could be taking in the same amount of food, but if we're in this hypometabolic state and low thyroid state, we're going to be converting a greater proportion of it toward body fat. And then we end up with weight gain, even if we're not eating a lot. And that's where a lot of people find themselves.
I was really curious, Jay, if you could expand on why is it that folks suffering from Hashimoto in particular have a tendency towards weight gain?
Yeah, so when we're talking about Hashimoto's, we're talking about a situation where there's inflammation and irritation in the thyroid gland, and you basically end up starting to see damage there. And so as a result of that, you start to see less thyroid hormone being produced. And so this is a really common presentation of hypothyroidism. It's a really common diagnosis, the Hashimoto's. And we can talk a little bit about what some of those drivers are. But when that happens, we're basically having less of the signal that keeps our metabolic rate high. So we're in a state where we have a lack of metabolic stimulation, a lack of the thing that keeps our metabolism up. So we're basically saying, when we have this fuel coming in, we're not producing that much energy from it, and we're storing it toward body fat. And the other thing that happens there, when we don't have enough energy, our hunger signals increase, because our hunger is tied to not actually the fuel coming in, but what happens to it. It's tied to that ATP availability. When we're not converting fuel to energy well, or we don't have enough ATP in the liver or in a part of the brain called the hypothalamus, our hunger signals stay elevated. So this is why I think a lot of people have this experience, and I know I did at one point, where you can eat a full meal, but if dessert comes out, that's not a problem. We can keep eating that, and we have to stop ourselves. Even if we're physically full, we know on one hand, like, we shouldn't be eating that. We don't want to be eating that. But there's a part of us that really does. That's still physiologically hungry for energy. And it's not some fault of willpower or restriction. And that's what most people think that it is. And then they tell themselves, I was bad today. Shouldn't have done that. Next time I won't do that. I have to eat less tomorrow, whatever it is. But the reality is, this is your your body's signals that are screaming for energy because we're not actually using the fuel that's coming in well. We don't have that ATP. So your body's doing exactly what it's supposed to do, right? If it doesn't have the ATP there, it says we need to keep getting more fuel in so we can get enough ATP. But it's just that in the process of doing so, weight gain often happens because we're not actually addressing that underlying problem.
That's really interesting. Now, I really want to talk about what thyroid blood work look like, because typically we have at least 3 different markers, and I would love if you walk us through the importance of them. So from the THS, the T4, the T3, but also the ratio, and why is it so important to ask a doctor to check free T3 and free T4? Can you talk us through that?
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a handful of different markers we can use to assess our thyroid function. We can start with just those symptoms we talked about earlier and taking our body temperature, right? And if our body temperature is low when we wake up in the morning, we should be seeing it around 97.8 to 98.0. That's Fahrenheit. In Celsius, we're looking at like 36.7 in the morning. That's ideal. And then later in the day, we want to see that we're getting up to 98.6 at least in the afternoon, or that's 37 in Celsius in the afternoon. So if we're not hitting those numbers, that already tells us we're in a hypometabolic state. That's one marker that we can use. Of course, we have those other markers, energy and sleep and cold hands and feet and hair, skin, and nails. Were you going to say something about the body temperature?
Yes, I would really love. I know you said if we're not at, say, 36.7, but how low is considered low? For example, if we're 36.1, is that low? Like, where do we know? So if we have somebody listening thinking, oh, I did my TAM this morning and it was 36.1, how do they evaluate? How far out from 36.7 do you need to be, or in Fahrenheit?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely low. If we're in the 36.5 to 36.7 range, I mean, that's okay. But really anything below that when we're waking up is low. And that there can be a number of reasons for that. It can have to do with our sleep quality or how much we ate the day before or a number of other factors, but that is lower than optimal. And then same on the Fahrenheit side, 97.8 is that marker. And so if we're at 97.5, 97.6, I'm not majorly concerned, but it's a little low. But especially when we're getting below that, low 97s or below. And I have people who, coming to me who are in the 95s, sometimes low 96s, but sometimes 95s, or in Celsius side, we're at 35. And yeah, that's severely low.
Yeah, I've been there, so I can relate.
Yeah.
And Jay, just to clarify, is this gender specific, or is this the same for men and women when we talk about temperature?
It's not gender specific, but with women, we have to consider the cycle and the natural temperature fluctuations. So for women who are cycling, these numbers are really for the luteal phase, second half of the cycle. In the follicular phase, it's normal for it to be a little bit lower, waking and later in the day.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, that's really good to know. Let's carry on.
Sure. So yeah, those are all markers that we can take a look at, take stock of at home and identify, whether it's likely that we might have hypothyroidism. But then, yeah, it can be great to get some blood work to corroborate that. And the only thing when it comes to blood work is it requires some interpretation. There are some factors that can be a little tricky, but when we look at it all together, we can sometimes see a pretty clear picture. So in terms of the thyroid markers themselves, TSH is normally the one that all doctors will test. And they'll say, if your TSH is in range, you're fine. There's a number of problems with that. The first being that the range that they provide is, I wouldn't say useless, but is pretty far off from what's actually been shown to be optimal in the research. And it was never based on doing studies where they tried to find out what was optimal. What happened was they've done a number of different forms of thyroid testing over the years, and they just took the range from the last test and looked at the standard deviation of the people who were assumed to be hypothyroid based on that test, and then applied that to TSH. The big problem with that is the last test they were doing, which had to do with iodine uptake and some other factors like that, were totally irrelevant. They weren't actually accurate for assessing thyroid function, but they used the same assumptions built in there to determine the range for TSH. And what we're starting to see very slowly is that it has been scaled back a little bit. So not too long ago, I would see blood tests come back and the range for TSH would sometimes say that up to 8 or 10 was totally normal. And now they've scaled back to at least like 4.5 in a lot of cases. But even that is still very hypothyroid if we're seeing numbers, TSH above 3, let's say. And in the research, really, we find that optimal is 1.5 or below, but at least wanting to be below 2. When we're above 2, we're really seeing that is a level of hypothyroidism. Obviously, there are levels here, but that's definitely where I would be scaling that range down to. But then there's another factor as well when it comes to TSH, and that is regulated by a number of other factors. And one of the big ones is stress and cortisol. So what can happen is you can be in a state of very high stress and high cortisol, and that when that happens, our body says, this is not a good environment. I need to turn down my metabolic rate. So one of the things it does is it turns down TSH, because TSH is the thyroid stimulating hormone. It tells the thyroid to produce hormones. And so cortisol actually turns down the TSH levels, even if you don't have enough thyroid available. So what can happen is normally, the reason why high TSH indicates hypothyroidism is because the body is saying there's not enough thyroid hormones. Let's stimulate the thyroid to produce more. And that's where you see high TSH.
And I was going to say, because that can get super confusing for folks, right? And it confused me when my doctor told me you have hypothyroidism. Oh, I can't even pronounce it. You're going to have to do it for me.
Yeah, hypothyroidism.
This one. But your THS is really high. I thought, wait, how does that work? Like, just explain that again to make it super clear, because I found it a little bit hard to wrap my head around at first.
Yeah, so the actual thyroid hormones are T3 and T4. So we want those to be higher, not lower, right? If those are low, that tells us, okay, we're probably hypothyroid. TSH is not actually produced from the thyroid. It's produced from the pituitary, which is a different gland, that tells the thyroid to produce more hormones. And it's regulated by the amount of thyroid hormone you have available. So if you have a lot of thyroid hormone available, your body says, we don't need any more, and TSH goes down. The pituitary senses that, and TSH goes down. If you don't have a lot of thyroid hormone available, your body says, we need more, and it turns up the TSH. So that's why a high TSH level typically indicates a low thyroid state. There's not a lot of thyroid hormones. Our bodies are saying they need more. So that's the relationship there. But it does get a little complicated because other things like stress and cortisol turn down TSH, even if you don't have enough thyroid hormones available. So you can have low T3 and low T4 in your body. And normally your body would say, let's produce more, let's increase TSH. But then cortisol comes in and says, we're really in a physiologically stressed state right now for one reason or another. So let's turn down the TSH. So that's a case where you can have low TSH levels, but still be hypothyroid and sometimes still severely hypothyroid. So that's one reason why we don't want to just look at TSH in isolation. And then the other is because in general, TSH is mostly regulated by our T4 levels, the amount of T4 that we have in our bodies. But T4 is the inactive thyroid hormone. It doesn't actually increase our metabolic rate. It's just a precursor to T3, which is the active thyroid hormone. It has to be converted from T4 to T3 to increase the metabolic rate. And there are a number of things that can interfere with that conversion. And so we can have normal levels of T4 and your TSH can be low, but you might not actually be converting it effectively to T3. And so that's another scenario where you can be hypothyroid even if your TSH is low. So that's why we can't look at TSH in isolation. It is helpful to see because if it's high, we know there's a hypothyroid state. But if it's low, we don't know. You still could be hypothyroid or you could be in a good thyroid state.
I just love that you said that. And I really want to highlight how important it is to hear that message, because I've had doctors who looked at my THS and when it got back to range said, because the THS is in range, we no longer need to check the T3, T4. And it just is so frustrating when you get that medical note, because when you're educated on thyroid that the investigation should not stop there. And if you really want to know if the treatment plan or whatever protocol you've been using have been truly efficient, you should carry on checking the T3 and T4, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's no level of TSH that tells us we don't need to look at the other ones. We want to look at that whole picture. Once we're in if we're in a good, healthy spot and we've worked on our thyroid status and all of the rest, and we just want to check TSH alone, there's a place for that, but definitely not in the scenario you were talking about.
If you're enjoying this show so far, I just have a very quick favor to ask you. Could you go ahead and click the follow button or the subscribe button? It would mean so much to me, and it would really help to grow our show so that we can enhance the production, we can bring you the best possible guests, and we can have the most amazing conversations. So if you haven't already done this, please take a moment today to go ahead and click the follow button or the subscribe button. Thank you so much. And now let's go back to this amazing conversation. Yes, absolutely. So, how can the conversion go wrong? What could happen in somebody that wouldn't convert well? What would go wrong and why would that happen? And how frequent is that?
So there are a handful of different things that affect T4 to T3 conversion. One of the main sites that this happens is at the liver. That's where a lot of T4 comes in. We convert it to T3 and we send it back out into circulation. There's also other tissues that just take up the T4 and convert it to T3 inside inside the tissue. But the liver is really our main site of where we convert it and then put it back out for the rest of the body. And so liver function is really central here. And there's a number of things that'll decrease our conversion from T4 to T3 in a protective way. And that comes back mostly to stress. That's, the cortisol we were talking about earlier, but it's not only cortisol. So we can come back to that. But essentially, if our bodies are sensing that it's not a good energetic environment, we want to turn down our metabolic dial. One of the ways we do that biochemically is by lowering the conversion of T4 to T3. That process gets slowed down. Cortisol and other stress hormones like glucagon and epinephrine are some of the main ones that do that block that conversion. And these are produced not just when we're psychologically stressed, maybe, tough day at work, or, we're frustrated in the traffic or something. Those are, stressful, and we will see increases in stress hormones, but also if we're overexercising and not effectively recovering, if we're under eating, if we're fasting, if we're doing a lot of, cold plunges. A lot of the things that we're taught to do that we're told are healthy for us are very stressful. And as a result of that stress, when we increase those stress hormones, it turns down the metabolic dial. So these are things that we definitely need to be aware of, because those are things that will turn down that conversion from T4 to T3 in a lot of cases. And then there are some other factors that directly affect liver function. Things like the polyunsaturated fats can be problems here. And these are the fats that are the omega-6s and omega-3s. They're found in the seed oils that a lot of people are talking about now. They have a number of effects with thyroid hormone production, thyroid hormone conversion, and actually you can even have the conversion of T4 to T3, and the polyunsaturated fats they'll basically block the cells from responding to the T3, even if you have it there. So they're problematic in a number of ways, but they do impact that conversion there. Another one is gut issues and microbial issues, bacterial issues in the intestines that produce very toxic compounds that we absorb. Those go to the liver, create some irritation there, and that'll lower T4 to T3 conversion. And then another one that's worth touching on is nutrient deficiencies. There's a number of nutrients involved directly with that conversion, specifically selenium, zinc, vitamin E, vitamin A. Those are all important for that conversion from T4 to T3. And so a deficiency in any of those can also cause problems there.
And this is why a pro-metabolic diet, if we follow the advice of Ray P or all other proponent of the pro-metabolic diet, will have a diet that includes quite a lot of vitamin E, selenium, zinc, etc. Right?
Yeah, definitely.
That's something that I've definitely taken on board. And after I knew this and the seed oils, I've become a bit of a sort of a seed oil obsessed cutter. I am just fearing them like the plague.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good thing.
For anyone listening who doesn't know where their seed oil could live or could hide, what could we say and what should we be mindful of and what should we absolutely get rid of?
Yeah, the seed oils are pretty ubiquitous. So in most processed foods, most things that are in a package, take a look at the ingredients. We're looking for canola oil, corn oil, soy oil, sunflower seed or sunflower oil, and they're found in most of those packaged processed foods. And The other big one would be anything from a restaurant. Normally, they're all using those sorts of oils for cooking. You can always ask and find out. Some, better restaurants might use olive oil, but it's been unfortunately surprising that even a lot of very nice restaurants are, coating steaks in like grapeseed oil or something like that before frying them or grilling them. So
Mm.
it can be a challenge to avoid them, but restaurants are a big one. Fried food is the biggest, right? If we're talking about French fries or something like that, those are fried directly in those sorts of seed oils. And then I think there are some hidden ones too that a lot of people aren't aware of. And so that would come back to some of our sources of meat, animal products, where a lot of the groups that are talking about the negatives of seed oils aren't also mentioning that the chicken and pork fat can be just as high in polyunsaturated fats as the seed oils, because that's a lot of the fat that they're consuming. They're eating a lot of soy and corn, and their fat composition changes to have just as much polyunsaturated fats in there. So we have to be really careful with what our food is eating, when it comes to pork and chicken. And if you're not sure, or if it's not ideal, I would just lean toward really lean cuts, like chicken breast, for example, which, even though the chicken might have high amounts of PUFA in there, basically high amounts of seed oils, the chicken breast is very lean. So you're not going to be getting much of that fat. So that's something to be aware of. It's not as much of an issue with beef and ruminant animals, lamb, goat, and also dairy, because they convert the polyunsaturated fats to the saturated fats. So it's largely not an issue for those. Like, even if they're eating a lot of corn, it's still not ideal, but it's still not going to be high in PUFA like chicken and pork.
That's really good advice. So, just to make sure I heard this correctly, if we were talking to somebody who has meat as a big staple in their diet, somebody like me, I wrote a whole ebook about why we should eat more meat. We should perhaps just gravitate more towards your cow, bison, lamb, and avoid the chicken and the pork, particularly the fatty cuts, right?
Yeah, unless you know what it's being fed. And if it's fed a really good low PUFA diet, then I think it's fine. And we can also lean into low fat seafood options, low fat fish and shellfish, shrimp. Those are all great options too that are low in PUFA.
Do we need to keep our diet relatively low fat when we suffer or have hypothyroid, or can we have the good fat? I'm talking the butter, the ribeye, I'm talking all of the ghee, the coconut, all of the good fat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those fats are great. And most of the time, we're fine having a decent amount of those. The reason I was talking about low fat when it comes to the seafood is the same as for the chicken and pork, right? If we're going to eat those, we want the lean cuts because we don't want a lot of those polyunsaturated fats.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, butter, coconut oil, olive oil, macadamia nuts, tallow, are all great, very low PUFA fats. And in general, yeah, we don't need to be avoiding them. There are circumstances where, if we're dealing with some insulin resistance, or we're very overweight, we're not very active, it can help us to lower our fat intake a little bit. But that's not like a universal recommendation. It kind of depends on the circumstances.
One thing that really struck me with your work, Jay, and one of the reason amongst many I was so excited to talk to you, is because you actually wrote a whole blog, an article about how T4 only medication could not only not be very effective, but be relatively harmful. And that has happened to me. And just to give you a little bit of background, in France, where I get my medication prescribed, it's actually extremely difficult, not to say impossible, to be prescribed T3. So about 20 years ago, France stopped offering desiccated thyroid as a pharmaceutical solution. So when pharmaceutical solution existed, like T4 caps, they removed desiccated thyroid. So now when you go to an endocrinologist and you're told that you have hypothyroid, you're offered T4. And even if you ask for T3, like I have, you're being told no. So welcome to my world.
Yeah, well, and it's not just your world. I mean, that's all over the world. And in the States too, I mean, Synthroid or levothyroxine, the T4 only, is, I want to say, the number 4 most prescribed medication. It's up there, top 4 for sure. And if you,
Of all medication,
yeah,
of thyroid, of all prescribed medications.
of all prescribed medications, yeah, it's up there with statins and a couple others. Yeah.
Is that a good thing, Jay? I feel like I'm a bit worried about that.
Yeah, I am too. And for the vast majority of the population going to their doctor, it's exactly what you described. It's the doctor looks at the TSH levels. If they're in range, they say you're totally fine and dismiss, unfortunately. And again, there are some great doctors out there, but the vast majority would dismiss anything you say as far as symptoms. Even if you listed all the hypothyroid symptoms, they would say your TSH is fine. So nothing wrong there. And if it is out of range, then they prescribe Synthroid or levothyroxine, which is just T4. That's 98% of the doctors in the US. When you get into the integrative functional medicine practitioners, the people who are not oriented toward conventional medicine so much, that's when you start to see people who will prescribe T3 or desiccated thyroid. But it's really uncommon in the US as well. Not as hard to get as in France and some other countries, but that's the standard of care. And that, the T3 was phased out as well as desiccated thyroid was phased out once Synthroid came on the market and really took over in terms of marketing. And they basically looked at young, healthy 20-year-old men who didn't have thyroid issues, and they gave them T4 and said everything looked fine. Their thyroid values, increased, and their hypothyroid, any hypothyroid symptoms improved. And so Synthroid is fine. Everyone should just use Synthroid. Not considering that Synthroid is T4 only, right? That's the inactive thyroid hormone, and it has to be converted to the active T3 thyroid hormone to have any effect. And for the vast majority of the population who's hypothyroid, which tends to be women, I want to say above the age of 40, and those are people who tend to have a lot of issues with converting T4 to T3 due to some of the liver issues I was referring to, due to the chronic stress, and then also estrogen itself, which can actually be a major issue for T4 to T3 conversion. And so as a result of that, you have all of these people who are taking T4. They don't feel any different. They go to their doctor, and their doctor says the TSH came back into range, so you're fine. Your thyroid's fine. Any of those other symptoms you had before, those must not have been related to your thyroid, because we know your TSH is in range, so you're not hypothyroid anymore. And it's a huge disservice on a number of levels. We end up gaslighting people and telling them that whatever you're feeling, it has nothing to do with your physiology. It's not a thyroid issue. On top of that, we're providing medication that not only isn't helping because we're not getting the conversion to T3, but it actually ends up making the hypothyroid situation worse for two reasons. One is that when we have a lot of this T4 coming in from a medication, it suppresses our thyroid activity. So we're not producing T4, which is fine because we already have it coming in, but the thyroid gland also isn't producing T3. So we have less T3 production from the thyroid than we had before. And then on top of that, when the T4 doesn't get converted to T3, it gets converted to a different thyroid hormone called reverse T3. And reverse T3 actually blocks the effects of T3. So it's not just that you don't get the T3, but you have an increase in the anti-thyroid hormone, reverse T3, which lowers your thyroid activity even more. And again, the doctor looks at your lab work, says TSH is fine, you're not hypothyroid. And the person says, well, I check all the boxes, and I'm definitely not feeling good, and my energy is low, and this weight won't come off, and I'm freezing, and I need to take a nap every afternoon, or I feel like I need to. I'm falling asleep while I'm driving my car, and my hair is falling out, and there's no answer for that.
And that could be the T3, right? The fact that actually the T4 is not really helping solve the whole picture because T3 is not the way it should be.
Yeah, they're basically more hypothyroid than they were before. They have less T3 and more reverse T3. And so even though their TSH looks normal, they're feeling hypothyroid, and that's because they are. It's just that the TSH got suppressed by the T4 that they're taking.
So then, Jay, what do we do if we're in this position and our doctor tells us that we can't get our hands on T3? What do we do?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's a challenging one, especially because not only are a lot of doctors not open to prescribing anything other than T4, but they also oftentimes aren't open to the other blood tests, right? We're talking about that how TSH on its own isn't enough, but a lot of doctors won't test for T3 or T4, let alone reverse T3 as well. They're basically taught that unless you're in a hospital bed, basically so sick due to low T3, it's not an issue. Either you have severely low T3 and severely high reverse T3 to the point that you are in a hospital, or you're fine. It's one of those two. There's no situation where you could just chronically have low T3 levels that aren't so severe that you're about to die. And so it's not even acknowledged as an issue. And so because of that, doctors are generally, or many doctors are, I should say, are generally not open to testing anything other than TSH. And they're not open to prescribing something other than T4, which puts us in a really tough situation. And that's part of why I was pointing to the symptoms and the temperature earlier, because these are things that anybody can do at home to identify if you're still hypothyroid despite a normal TSH. So I think it's really helpful to have those tools if we can't get those other blood tests. Luckily, there are some really good doctors, and there are a lot of ways that you can privately order blood tests in different countries where you can get T3 and T4 and reverse T3 to get a little bit of a better idea of what's actually happening. There are some other markers we can look at as well in the blood tests. We can look at the lipids, cholesterol and LDL. When LDL is elevated, that can often also be a sign of a low thyroid state, because our thyroid is needed to utilize the cholesterol that our bodies produce and take in. Cholesterol is our primary precursor, or it's the precursor to all of our steroid hormones. So all of the reproductive hormones, progesterone, testosterone, all come from cholesterol. And the main determinant of that conversion is thyroid. Basically, we can't convert cholesterol to those steroid hormones without T3. And so because of that, we can see a buildup of cholesterol levels and an increase in LDL if our thyroid is really low. So that can be an indicator that a lot of people can look at on their blood work that could tell them that they're in a hypothyroid state, if they can't get those other blood markers. So that would be a starting place. And then if we have come to this point where we've identified, all right, it seems like I'm on T4, but I'm definitely still hypothyroid. What do I do? That's, there's a number of things to consider, but we have to consider it kind of in order. Because what we don't want to do, and this is something we didn't even talk about, which is that just because you have a hypothyroid problem doesn't mean we just want to throw hormones at it to begin with, even if the T4 was working. Sometimes that can be even worse, because what's happening is your body is pumping the brakes. Your body is saying, this is not a good environment. I don't have enough fuel. I can't use it well. There's these toxic things, whether it's the pesticides preventing me from converting T4 to T3, or from blocking the mitochondria, or I'm not sleeping well, which is having the same issues. All of these different factors are basically telling your body to pump the brakes. If we then throw thyroid hormones on top of that, we're pressing the brakes and the gas at the same time. The engine's not working right because we have all these blockages, and then our bodies are trying to save us from that, and we're trying to just hit the gas. And that can sometimes make things a lot worse, creates a lot more stress. And so first thing always is we want to identify which of those foundational areas is not going well. Are we dealing with nutrient deficiencies? Are we under eating? Are we overexercising? Are we undersleeping? Are we exposed to generally a very stressful, toxic environment? We want to address those things. And ideally, that alone will get us to a much better state with our thyroid health and our metabolic health. And we might not need to go beyond that, but that's definitely the starting place. After we've done that, then we might say, all right, I've seen some good improvements. I'm feeling a lot better, but I know I still have some of these hypothyroid symptoms that are lingering, and they're not improving at the rate that I'd like for them to. And it's not just a preference; it's also the fact that when our thyroid is low, it leaves us susceptible to gut issues. It lowers our stomach acid, it slows our motility, it leaves us very prone to SIBO. There's a really tight correlation between hypothyroidism and SIBO. As we talked about before, it affects our reproductive hormones. It affects our immune function. So when we have a low thyroid state, even when we get the fundamentals to a good spot, it can take a while to really see the shifts that we'd like. And so after we have those foundations in place, that's a situation where it might help to have a little bit of thyroid hormone support to increase our progression there. When we've had years or decades of suppressing our metabolism, our body's not going to just turn around the next day, right? It takes some time for it to really recognize, okay, this is actually a good environment. I'm safe to turn up my metabolic rate and produce more energy. I don't need to store it and to kind of be in that hibernation state anymore. And so providing a good mix, a good balance between T3 and T4 can be really helpful in that scenario once we've gotten our foundation sorted out. And that's a place where we might want to use some desiccated thyroid or a T3 and T4 combination, or sometimes even just T3 if we have major conversion issues.
Can there be a world where someone takes T4 and actually gets better? Is it possible that someone just gets T4 and because they have good conversion, that really heals their hypothyroid?
Yeah, it's just pretty uncommon. Normally, when we've gotten to the point,
Jay, I was really hoping for good news there. I
yeah, I
love the
would say,
honesty, though.
yeah. I mean, I really really uncommon. Unfortunately, I mean, we're talking like I would say 5% or less of people, because normally when we've gotten to that place of a hypothyroid state, we're also in a state where our conversion is low. It's pretty rare that we're just blocked at the thyroid and we don't have a conversion issue.
Mm. And you would know that only through looking at your reverse T3, right?
That's the best way, but of course, there's layers of complication here. So if we have, like, if our TSH is very high or is very low and it's suppressed by cortisol, that means there's not a lot of T3 or T4. Our overall amount of thyroid hormones is low. And so reverse T3 is produced from T4 when we have bad conversion. But if there's not a lot of T4, your reverse T3 might not be that high because you have so little T4 available. So that's a point where we kind of look at a ratio between our thyroid status and our reverse T3 levels in order to identify if there's likely a conversion issue. And so it gets a little tricky, but we know for sure if reverse T3 is elevated that we have a conversion issue. And if it's low, we just have to consider, okay, does it seem like my total thyroid availability is very low? Because if so, we can't rule out a conversion issue with reverse T3. What we could do though is if we're taking T4, then and we were taking like a good amount of it, and then look at reverse T3, it's going to be a pretty good marker of our conversion because we know we have enough T4 there, and then we can see how well we're converting. Normally, I would prefer we don't go that route to begin with, but if we're already in that place, it can be a helpful marker there.
It can be a helpful one. Now, I'll tell you what I did when I
Sure.
was faced with this challenge, and I'm really happy for you to tear apart my plan. I'm giving you full permission, but I was reading a lot about this T3 T4 conversion, and so I decided to go against my French doctor's advice, and I decided to take desiccated thyroid from bovine source, from a very reliable source. I made sure that it was really high quality, and my latest TSH result have gone back to not just normal range. I hate that term. What I consider to be optimal range.
Great. I mean, that's awesome. Yeah.
It's
And
interesting though, because when you say that to a lot of conventional doctor, and again, not calling out doctors here, I think there are wonderful, extraordinary doctors out there, but not holistic doctors. And I tell them what I've done. They say, oh, this is so dangerous. This is not conventional. There is no way of measuring and tracking what you're doing. We don't know the bioavailability. We don't really know the dosage. How can we reproduce this pharmaceutically? I have a whole laundry list of things that I've been told. So
yeah, and it's pretty crazy on one hand. I mean, we're not talking about most doctors, again, we're talking about maybe we're generalizing. Of course, there are really great ones.
of
So
course.
there's that disclaimer. We don't have to mention it every time we mention this because most people's experience are like this. But we're not talking about adding some synthetic chemical that our bodies have never experienced, which is most drugs. Whether we're talking statins, blood pressure medications, all of the top medications, they're entirely not only synthetic, but entirely foreign molecules that our bodies don't produce. That's most of what medications are. This isn't a scenario like that. We're talking about providing the actual hormones that our bodies normally produce, T3 and T4. And we're just talking about providing both of them instead of just T4. The fear here, I think, is so disproportionate compared to what a lot of doctors are comfortable with in terms of treatment. And the reason for it is there's been a lot of fear mongering that basically providing T4 can be dangerous due to heart issues. That's really the main concern. And this
Do you
has to
mean
do with,
T3? When you say
yes, T3.
providing T3, oh, right. I just
Yeah. Maybe I misspoke. Yeah. Providing
Oh, no,
T3.
no, no. It's. I'm glad because I've been told as well that T3 can be very dangerous for the heart, and especially because of my history. My father had a heart attack, so I got the whole reason why I wasn't eligible for T3. So I would really love to go down that rabbit hole because I think a lot of it is bullshit. But yes, let's
Yeah,
do
it
it.
is. It is. Yeah, so that's what's told, and that's why a lot of doctors are fearful about T3. And there's a couple of reasons for it. One is there were a couple of situations of thyrotoxicosis with ground meat, where ground meat used to contain ground organs in there, and especially thyroid. And so there was a situation where supposedly it was just a number of cases, a large amount of thyroid gland was ground into this ground meat, and people ate these hamburgers, and there was an uptick in heart attacks in a handful of people. So that was one of the kind of lines of evidence as to why there's this fear here. But then the other one has to do with the way that most thyroid hormone is provided, which is they say, all right, we're going to give you T3 and T4. We'll give you around 25 to 35 micrograms of T3, which is the total amount that your body produces. So take that in the morning on an empty stomach. That is a huge issue for a number of reasons. One is T3 has a relatively short half-life, meaning that it's not a slow build and it just stays in your body like T4 does. T4, its half-life is 10 days or so, 7 days. It builds up over quite a bit of time. T3, it's about 6 hours. And so because of that, when we take this, basically the entire amount of T3 your body's supposed to produce in an entire day, and you take it in the morning, first thing on an empty stomach, you get a massive spike in T3 levels, which is kind of like a huge spike in caffeine. It's as if you were to take a few cups of coffee all at once. And that's potentially a problem, of course, when it comes to a stress effect in somebody who maybe has cardiovascular issues, especially when we're talking about doing it first thing in the morning where our stress hormones are peaked and we have no fuel, we have no food on board to help lower the stress hormones. So there are these concerns if someone was to do this, if they were to take the full amount of T3 their body's supposed to produce in a day and take it all at once on an empty stomach and get this massive spike of T3, it can cause stress symptoms. It can cause heart palpitations. It can cause issues in terms of in terms of the cardiovascular side. But it's not because of the T3 itself. It's because of the basically improper dosing, the improper utilization of it. And so instead, if we are using T3, we want to spread it out throughout the day in smaller doses, and ideally take it with food, which helps to slow down the absorption of the T3. And it does decrease the absorption a little bit, talking like maybe 5 to 10%, but that just means that we can adjust our dosing accordingly. But that way we get a much slower trickle, just like our bodies would naturally be producing. So that's really where a lot of the fear comes from with using T3 or anything with T3 like desiccated thyroid.
That makes a lot of sense. And is that also true for T4? What I mean by that is when I was prescribed T4 only, I was told by the doctor to take it upon waking up and 15 minutes before any food and any coffee, and to space it out from any other medication. Is that also a potential prescription issue, or is that okay considering that's T4 and not T3? So better tolerated by the body when in a fasted state?
Yeah, so it doesn't matter as much with the T4 because that half-life is more like 7 days. The amount that your body already has a built up amount of T4 that's just always in the body over the last 7 to 10 days. And so taking an extra amount, it's a really small portion of the total amount, and it's not having an immediate effect because it has to be converted to T3 to have that effect. So it's kind of like you're adding more fuel to a gas tank, but that doesn't mean all that fuel goes right into the engine. And if you put too much fuel in, the engine like catches fire or something. We use the T4 on a measured basis. There's a lot of regulation there. Whereas instead the T3, again, I'm using different analogies here, but it's just like throwing a bunch of lighter fluid on a fire. It's just used immediately.
That makes a lot of sense. We've spoken a lot about medication, desiccated thyroid. The last question I want to ask before we wrap up and move on to another topic is, if somebody like me finds that they're doing really well on desiccated thyroid and lifestyle choices and removing the seed oils and having a pro-metabolic diet, which I've been having now for a few years, do we say we keep the desiccated thyroid forever, or can there ever be a point of healing from hypothyroid issues, or are we a bit stuck with it?
We're definitely not stuck. You can absolutely get to a point where you can start to lower that dose. And This is one of the reasons why while we're using the thyroid, we want to continue to monitor our symptoms and, monitor the blood tests over time. Because what we might find is that, the TSH levels get too low, T3 levels might get too high, and that could be a sign that we can start to decrease at that point. But also, we don't have to wait for that point. We can start to slowly lower the desiccated thyroid once we're in that place where we're really feeling optimal. Our motility is good. That was one that I didn't talk about as a hypothyroid symptom, but constipation is a major hypothyroid symptom. So when we're at a point where our motility is good, our energy is good, we're sleeping well, mood is good, hair is growing thicker, reproductive hormones are all in a good spot. That's a time where once we've hung out there for a little bit, we can start to lower that dose. And oftentimes, as long as we do it kind of slowly and carefully, our thyroid gland will kick back into gear and be producing the thyroid hormone, so we don't need to rely on the exogenous source.
Hmm. I've had a lot of clients, Jay, that have really struggled with fertility, particularly, in the later 30s, maybe early 40s, and found out that they had issues around their thyroid. Could you quickly walk us through why that might be a challenge when trying to conceive and why thyroid is so important for fertility?
There are so many, so many connections there, on the female and the male side too, because
Oh, that's refreshing to hear. I would like to hear both actually, because we tend to really focus on the female side, but I
Mhm.
would really love to hear the males as well.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, obviously the frequency of issues for fertility for women is really high as well, and PCOS, endometriosis. I mean, there's so many related issues there that are really common. But also, infertility on the male side is becoming increasingly common too, and it's normally not really looked at. So if someone is struggling to conceive, we definitely want to be looking at both sides. And thyroid hormone is super important for both. One of the main reasons that we were talking about earlier is the impact of T3 on our steroid hormone production. The steroid hormones include our reproductive hormones. So if we don't have enough T3 there, we literally can't convert cholesterol to pregnenolone, which is the precursor to all of those other hormones, including progesterone and estrogen as well. And so without enough, and testosterone too. And so without enough T3, we're bottlenecked, right? We just can't produce enough of those hormones, not to mention a number of other areas. So one is the impact of T3 on motility and liver function. When those are problems, we can't actually detoxify effectively. And that doesn't just mean pesticides and heavy metals and things like that, but it also means hormones. And excess estrogen is a major problem for a lot of women with fertility issues. And it's a major driver of PCOS and endometriosis and infertility itself. And when we have excess estrogen, the way we clear it out is we detoxify it in the liver, and then it goes into the bile, which goes into the intestines, and then we clear it out when we have the bowel movement. When we have slow motility and poor detoxification in the liver, we can't even get it from the liver to the intestines. But even if we do, because of slow motility, we tend to reabsorb a lot of that estrogen. So we're not actually able to clear it out. The other factor that comes in there is we end up really commonly with microbial issues like SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. We end up with overgrowth in the large intestine too. Those also cause an increase in enzymes that cause the reabsorption of estrogen. So they also prevent us from clearing estrogen. And they also produce really toxic compounds like endotoxin, which is also not only going to be a major issue for the liver and the thyroid, but also for infertility. There's a major connection between endotoxin levels, due to high levels of harmful bacteria in the gut, and infertility, endometriosis, and also a lot of other chronic health issues like high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, neurodegenerative issues. So these are some really fundamental problems. If you want to look at a connection between our fundamental metabolic issues and all of these other areas, we can look at this major correlation between hypothyroidism and pretty much every chronic health issue, or endotoxin and pretty much every chronic health issue. So it's this really integrated web that on one hand sounds complicated with all these different mechanisms and pathways, but the reality is it all comes back to our fundamental state. If we're nourishing ourselves well and we're not overstressed and we're sleeping well and we're supporting good gut health, we're not eating a lot of PUFA, not only does that help our thyroid state, but it also helps everything else that goes into health, and that also directly translates to fertility. But yeah, I mean, hypothyroidism is really tightly tied with these sorts of fertility issues for sure.
Is there any particular practical advice that you would like to give around holistic thyroid care? So again, just parking what we've talked about around pharmaceutical or desiccated thyroid, more like everyday metabolism, practical advice to boost it back up naturally beyond what we've already covered around PUFAs.
Yeah. Sure. So, I mean, the foundations often are the things that move the needle the most and seem the simplest, that's the good news, right? So, on a just trying to keep it simple, just initial starting places. First thing would be avoiding the polyunsaturated fats, right? So, not cooking with the seed oils, really trying to reduce our exposure to them, being really careful about what we're eating at restaurants and trying to minimize, the amount of polyunsaturated fat exposure there. As we talked about as well, being really careful with fatty chicken and pork. Alcohol is a big one. So just in general, lowering alcohol consumption, which I think
To Harlow, Jay. Harlow, break our bubble. Go on.
I mean, less is better. And I know there's some research that some people like to point to suggesting that, a glass of wine a day can be beneficial, but really the short answer there I would say is it's really not. It's not the absolute worst thing in the world, but it's not something that's actually benefiting us. And, avoiding it entirely is definitely best. Having it occasionally is not, in most cases, going to make or break anything. But when we're in a severely hypothyroid state or we're dealing with infertility or other chronic health issues, these are cases where we've dug ourselves into a metabolic hole, and the less that we can do to keep digging that deeper, the better, the faster we'll get out of it. So alcohol is just, if we can minimize it, that's definitely better. And yeah, I would say less is the least, the better for sure.
Understood.
Unfortunately.
Oh, well, yes. I'm doing this podcast from Bordeaux wine region right now, so you're breaking my bubble just a little bit, Jay.
Yeah, my wife would say the same thing. That's her favorite.
Okay, next. Let's break more bubbles.
Sure. Some of the other big ones are, when we talk about trying to reduce certain foods, I like to emphasize that there's a lot of foods that we want to increase, that we want to be eating more of, that we really want to emphasize. And this would be high quality, ripe fruit and cooked vegetables, root vegetables like potatoes and sweet potatoes. And fruit being a great option as well from the carb side. And then, animal-based sources of protein, the meat that we were talking about earlier, being careful with the fatty chicken and pork. When we're talking about cooking, using butter, ghee, olive oil, coconut oil, those kinds of things, really minimizing the PUFA, making sure we're eating enough and eating consistently throughout the day, not skipping meals.
So no intermittent fasting.
Yeah. Not something that's supportive from the thyroid side. And we see that in research where intermittent fasting lowers T3 levels. We see it with low carb diets as well that lower T3 levels. So I know that for a number of reasons, these are things that are often recommended for thyroid health, but the reality is that they are digging that metabolic hole deeper. They do have some benefits, especially in terms of the gut, right? We talked about earlier how much of an impact the gut has on other areas, but we can have those same improvements in the gut without turning down our metabolic rate, without avoiding the carbs or just not eating. And that's way better for our thyroid function, because avoiding carbohydrates especially leads to an increase in stress hormones that will decrease the T4 to T3 conversion. So it's something to be very aware of. And so many of the people who I work with have come from that world, whether it's been intermittent fasting or OMAD or low carb diets or just low calorie diets. And they see sometimes overt hypothyroidism, but a lot of times it's the problem with T4 to T3 conversion that they're never identifying on a blood test, but it's very apparent in their symptoms. And then if we get a blood test, we see it very clearly. So yeah, doing the opposite of those, getting a good amount of carbs with our meals, eating consistently throughout the day. It doesn't mean every hour, but having at least a good, 3 meals a day, maybe a snack or two in between if needed, is super important.
And Jay, when you say good carbs, Of course, we're talking about the healthy kind, but would that also include, in your opinion, grains like sourdough bread, for example? Because I know there is a hot debate. Some say that you should swear off gluten forever. Others says that if it's healthy sourdough, it's okay for the digestion and the thyroid. Where do you stand on that debate?
Yeah, for me, sourdough is one of the many foods that falls into that kind of gray area where normally when I'm having somebody start out, I would say carb sources, let's stick with the easiest to digest ones that are less likely to feed bacteria, less likely to cause bloating and gas and irritation, and that are most nutritious. Fruit is our best friend there, and then those cooked root vegetables can be really good as well. Maybe some white rice, which has all those new anti-nutrients stripped of it. But when it comes to kind of traditionally prepared grains like wheat that's fermented, which is sourdough, or sprouted oats or something like that, they fall into that gray area where some people are still going to have negative reactions to them, immune reactions or something like that. Other people, they're totally fine and they can be a good source of nutrition. So normally that would be that would be a category that I would avoid for a period of time, see how we're feeling, and then bring it back in carefully, let's say for a week, and see what you notice. Are you noticing joint pain? Are you bloated? Are you dealing with brain fog? Or are you feeling really good? And that can give us a pretty good indication.
How do you feel and where do you stand on honey and other forms of simple carbs like that? Because I know in the pro metabolic world, there is a lot of advocates for fresh orange juice, some honey, and things like that. Where do you stand on those items?
Yeah, I think those are generally great carb sources. There's always exceptions and things we need to be careful with, but in general, when we're talking about fruit, that can include fruit juices and dried fruit. And I know there's a lot of fear around those, but those have the carbohydrates and the nutrition that we need to effectively produce energy. So those can be really good carb sources. Honey can fall into there as well. It's not as nutritionally beneficial in that it doesn't have a lot of vitamins and minerals, but it can still be a really good carb source when we're trying to, when we're talking healthy carbs.
And now, last question that I had is what does our thyroid like and what our thyroid doesn't like in terms of physical activities?
Yeah. So, I mean, just coming back to the foundations, shifting the diet, like we were talking about, moving consistently, walking, getting, some bouts of real exercise a few times a week, um, getting good sleep, having good sleep hygiene, aiming for at least 8 hours a night. I know these are tough for a lot of people to do, but these are the foundational things that can make a huge difference for our thyroid function. And just a lack of sleep alone is shown to interfere with T4 to T3 conversion and cause low T3. So we need to keep in mind that everything that we're doing is providing a signal to our bodies saying either this is a harmful, stressful environment or this is a supportive, abundant environment. And so we want to keep that in mind. And the same comes with exercise. If we're doing a ton of exercise, especially on the endurance training side, that tends to be one where people are training a lot, a lot of time. Um, we're putting a major demand on our bodies, major demand. And when this is exceeding the amount of fuel we're providing, the nutrition we're providing, or when we're not able to compensate for it, our bodies are basically saying, this is not a good environment. We're constantly running from predators. We're maybe in a, panic, searching for food. There's an imbalance here. And so we can handle a good amount of exercise, a good amount of activity if we're really well nourished and we're sleeping well and we're focused on recovery and we're in a good metabolic state. But when we've done that, when we've dug that metabolic hole, we have to be really careful with how intensely we're training and how much we're training. And that can be something that's, again, pressing on the brake at the same time we're trying to press on the gas sort of thing. So it's something to be aware of. There's no universal answer because for some people, exercising an hour 3 times a week can be way too much. And they can be, the night after, the day after, they're not sleeping well, their energy's low, their libido's low, they're sluggish. That's overtraining for that person. For someone else, they could do that every day and be totally fine. So it's something where we want to be tuning into ourselves. We want to try to leave that mindset of just chronically pushing, right? We just need to push harder in the gym. We just need to force our bodies to burn off the extra calories. We really want to get away from that mindset and look at movement as something that can be really supportive, that we can enjoy, and can still be a really valuable and important part of our life, but we just want to make sure that we're doing it in the context of good recovery, not pushing too hard, and that we're seeing how we feel after and the day after, because those can often tell us a lot about uh, whether this is something that's helping or hurting us.
And I love that you mentioned chronically pushing. And that really brings me to the very last point I wanted to address, which is burnout in the sense of chronically pushing at work. Can you just give us like the last piece of advice around how that constant go, 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 busy, 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 always working, not looking after your health can actually have a knock-on negative impact on our metabolism and of course our thyroid. And of course I've learned this first-hand experience, but it would be really good to hear from your standpoint.
Of course. Yeah. And that was something that we started with, right? Talking about not this specifically, but that our modern environment is really not tailored toward a supportive, abundant one. And instead, we're dealing with, at every angle, every aspect of our life is one that tends to be digging us into that metabolic hole. And work is one of those. And it's one of the toughest ones because it's built so deeply into our culture. And there's a lot to unpack there. But I think the short and also I should say it's not like just a free choice for a lot of people. It's not like people could just choose to work less in a lot of circumstances. It's out of necessity, and I think that says a lot too about the current state of our culture and society. But on the health side, it's certainly not something that's helpful when it's coming at the cost of us being outside and being a good light, moving, having good enjoyable social relationships, getting enough sleep, and having having joy in our day and having calmness in our day. I think most of work for most people does not involve those things, and those
I
are
don't know what
important.
you're talking about, Jay. When I was an attorney, I was a Zen Buddhist calm person.
Of course.
I was breathing in and out all day, coming into the office, being a lawyer, being like, I am as calm can be.
I'm sure.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, and that's part of the challenge, right? Is the modern environment is not conducive to that, and but I think what we want to keep in mind is that the same way that every time we're taking a bite of food, that's providing a signal to our bodies, it's providing fuel and nutrients that it can use things with, that it can utilize to do things with, but it's also telling our bodies this is a good state or a bad state. This is a really abundant environment that's supportive of human physiology, or it's not, and we need to turn down our physiology. It's the stress and the day-to-day work life, all of that is also providing a signal, right? Our bodies are, it's just a part of our environment like any other, like the dirt beneath our toes and the sunlight and the air quality and all of the rest. That is something else that's having that two-way street with our with every aspect of our biochemistry and our hormones. And so I think we want to be conscious and intentional with that. And for most people, it's not a situation where we can just quit our jobs and focus entirely on health day to day. I wish that could be the case, but I think that's generally not the case. But we can still, if we're intentional about it, and we have this idea in mind, we can still make a point to make some small changes that can have a huge impact. And that can mean taking small breaks during the day to get outside, breathe a little bit, get some fresh air, get some sunlight, take a real lunch break, carve out some healthy boundaries between you and your work. Create, and that again, not just like lunch and eating, but sleep schedules. It's not always easy, but those are there are small things that we can do that make a huge difference like that.
I love the reminder, Jay, and I think it was really important for you to highlight being intentional about inserting moments of calm in our life, because even if we have a quote unquote stressful roles, I do believe we can insert a little bit of calm moments, and that's very important for thyroid. I restored mine, so there you go. Here's to hoping.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's totally possible. And I don't want it to be like, if you work a lot or you have a job that requires you to travel or you're really invested in something, that you can't be healthy. I work with people in that whole spectrum, and some people who are high charging entrepreneurs or who have, who are working really hard, and we can make that work. But it is a matter of being very intentional about it, especially when we know there are aspects of our environment that aren't going to be ideal. That just means that we have to be that much more conscious and really take some important steps to help mitigate that.
Jay, how do you want our listeners to get into your world, and how could you help them?
Well, I think the best place to start is to download the free Energy Balance Food Guide. We were talking about a starting place as far as diet goes. We talked through some of the best foods to start with, but I have a full infographic going through that. And it's, has a scale that tells people, here's the best foods for supporting your metabolism and your thyroid, and here are the ones you want to be more careful with. And especially when it comes to digestion, kind of like we were talking about earlier with the sourdough, where does that fit? Is it something that's going to be perfect, or do I have to be a little bit more careful with it? So all that's laid out in the food guide, and listeners can download that for free at jayfeldmanwellness.com/guide.
Awesome. Jay, I learned so much. I'm very grateful, and I wish you an amazing day and enjoy the company of your cats.
Thanks, Charlene. Have a great day. Thanks for having me.
Take care. Thank you for spending your time with me today and listening to this episode. Remember to subscribe so that you can receive weekly updates. And if today's message resonated with you, please remember to share it with a friend, a colleague, or a loved one who could really benefit from this episode.